In this podcast episode, Congressman Ro Khanna provides a comprehensive analysis of the current government shutdown in the context of broader economic, social, and political dynamics in the United States. The discussion ventures far beyond the immediate budgetary impasse to explore systemic issues such as debt, inflation, taxation, healthcare, education, and the cultural underpinnings of the American dream. Khanna begins by framing the government shutdown as fundamentally a budget question, but he insists it is more complex than a mere fight over numbers. For decades, passing a federal budget on time has been an elusive goal, highlighting systemic dysfunction in the political process. The recent government shutdown, he explains, stems largely from disagreements over healthcare premiums, specifically extensions of affordability provisions in the Affordable Care Act. Democrats want to extend these subsidies to prevent premium hikes that would harm millions, but Republicans resist increasing the deficit further. While the immediate cause is a partisan knockdown over these policy areas, Khanna underlines that this crisis is symptomatic of a broader failure: America's chronic deficit spending and reckless fiscal policies. He critiques the enormous debt and deficit levels tied to what he calls the Big Ugly Bill, arguing that deficits reaching 8% of GDP in peacetime are unsustainable, especially when prudent budgets should aim for under 4%. This disconnect between political decisions and economic sustainability is a root issue driving the shutdown and the larger fiscal malaise. The conversation quickly moves into a lament on the state of the American dream. Khanna poignantly observes that roughly 70% of Americans have lost faith in upward mobility, believing their children will not have better lives than they did. This despair is more than economic, it is a cultural crisis. He contrasts the optimism of his parents' generation, who arrived in America inspired by grand visions like the moon landing, with today's harsh reality where homes have become unattainable and prosperity seems elusive. The renaming of coffee companies to apartment buildings serves as a metaphor for the shrinking accessibility of basic assets. Khanna connects this erosion of hope with systemic economic problems, including inflation, stagnant wages, and wealth concentration. He describes how inflation, driven by chronic deficit spending and monetary policy, forces average Americans into asset ownership, primarily housing, at a time when those assets simultaneously become less affordable. The result is a vicious cycle that exacerbates inequality and frays social cohesion, threatening the foundational promise of the American dream. The congressman emphatically asserts the need for honest math in fiscal policymaking, advocating a combination of targeted tax increases on the ultra-wealthy and disciplined spending cuts to reduce the national debt by $12 trillion over 10 years. He proposes several measures, including a wealth tax on individuals with net worths exceeding $100 million, modest financial transaction taxes, lifting the corporate tax rate, closing estate tax avoidance loopholes, and taxing stock buybacks. Simultaneously, Khanna recommends disciplined cuts to large budget items such as the Pentagon and Medicare Advantage programs to maintain fiscal balance. Khanna's approach is pragmatic. He emphasizes that deficit spending is not inherently bad but must be productive, meaning it should result in long-term benefits that exceed costs. Investments in health, education, and infrastructure can fuel growth, but wasteful or unproductive expenditures exacerbate economic fragility. His clear-eyed analysis exposes the tension in American fiscal policy, balancing urgent social needs with the imperative of sustainable budgeting. A particularly illuminating segment of the conversation revolves around the distinction between taxing wealth and taxing income, a misunderstanding Khanna seeks to clarify. He supports taxing net worth rather than unrealized capital gains, arguing that the existing tax system allows ultra-rich individuals to accumulate vast wealth without paying proportional taxes, largely through undertaxed stock options and inheritance loopholes. Khanna acknowledges that wealth is often illiquid, tied up in assets like stock or real estate, but he contends that a small annual tax, such as 2% on net worth, would generate substantial revenue and be a fair contribution in light of America's extraordinary wealth concentration. While his interlocutor raises concerns about how taxing unrealized gains could force asset sales, Khanna stresses he supports taxing wealth as a whole, not the appreciation each year, and warns against confusion between wealth and income. He concedes that liquidation might sometimes be necessary, but believes the broader societal benefits of reducing inequality and funding healthcare and education outweigh the risks. This nuanced discussion underscores the complexities of modern taxation and its role in addressing fiscal and social challenges. The Affordable Care Act and its impact serve as a critical case study in the dialogue. Khanna acknowledges the ACA's successes in expanding coverage and reducing medical bankruptcies, but admits it did so at considerable cost with growing premiums. This reinforces his broader argument that simply throwing money at healthcare isn't enough. Systemic reform is essential to controlling costs and improving outcomes. He expresses openness to more ambitious solutions, including single-payer healthcare, which he believes could eliminate waste and reduce administrative overhead. Khanna also challenges the government and private sector's failure to produce better results despite high spending, criticizing inefficiencies and exploitative practices. He argues that healthcare investments are productive in principle, but calls for smarter spending tied to demonstrable outcomes. By framing healthcare both as an immediate humanitarian need and a long-term fiscal issue, Khanna highlights why it remains a central, contentious component of the budget debate and the shutdown. Education reform emerges as a richly explored topic, with Khanna voicing his concerns about the current system's failure to deliver quality outcomes commensurate with expenditure. While optimistic about AI's potential as a teaching aid, Khanna insists that technology cannot replace the human elements fundamental to education: inspiration, encouragement, and emotional support. He reflects affectionately on his own teacher's lasting impact in shaping purpose and motivation, qualities that AI cannot replicate. Keen on innovation, Khanna proposes radical ideas like using AI tutors to supplement classroom instruction for personalized learning, arguing that this could be a cost-effective way to improve performance. He stresses the need for a balanced approach that embraces technology without sacrificing the relational and aspirational aspects of education. Ultimately, Khanna sees education not only as skill acquisition, but also as fostering the mindset and resilience necessary for success in modern America. A philosophical undercurrent in the conversation concerns the appropriate scope of government intervention. Khanna and his interlocutor debate the tension between negative freedom, the protection from arbitrary state power, and positive freedom, the provision of resources and opportunities necessary for individuals to flourish. Khanna advocates for a middle ground. The government must provide essential rails such as healthcare and education, but must do so with minimal intrusion, avoiding overreach that stifles innovation, individual responsibility, and entrepreneurship. This tension reflects broader ideological divides in U.S. politics, with Khanna emphasizing the value of freedom as the engine of prosperity. He warns against the nanny state and excessive regulation that can undermine the very liberties and innovation that fuel economic growth. He balances this with a recognition of the government's vital role as a societal parent, providing necessary boundaries while cautioning against heavy-handedness that produces unintended consequences. One of the most pressing practical concerns Khanna highlights is housing affordability, especially in economically vibrant but cost-burdened regions such as Silicon Valley and New York. He explains that supply constraints driven by restrictive zoning and regulatory obstacles have funneled wealth into real estate speculation, pricing out working-class families and exacerbating inequality. Khanna lauds cities like Houston for their more permissive permitting policies that have helped stabilize housing costs and calls for doubling national housing construction, removing bureaucratic roadblocks, and curtailing private equity firms' speculative purchases of single-family homes. Khanna is wary of rent control and other government interventions that distort market incentives, advocating instead for freer market competition to bring down prices organically. While he is open to thoughtful first-time homebuyer assistance, he is skeptical of broad subsidies that risk creating bubbles or market distortions. Ultimately, housing reform is central to restoring Americans' ability to own productive assets and rebuild wealth, a key component of reviving the American dream. Khanna frames the economic challenges plaguing America within the concept of economic patriotism, a call to restore productive jobs and domestic manufacturing to rebuild the middle class and secure the nation's future. He argues that decades of deindustrialization, offshoring, and globalization have hollowed out local economies, creating social dislocation and economic insecurity. To reverse this trend, Khanna supports policies that incentivize bringing manufacturing back to the United States, strengthen supply chains, and cultivate innovation hubs near existing economic centers. This economic patriotism approach aims to re-anchor prosperity in tangible work, moving beyond speculative asset ownership toward genuine wealth creation. Khanna views this as both a security imperative and a moral mission to provide communities with stable, well-paying jobs that enable upward mobility. His stance challenges prevailing neoliberal orthodoxies and underlines the importance of an inclusive economic vision for national renewal. Khanna engages with the psychological and cultural forces fueling America's polarized populist moment. He elaborates on how economic insecurity breeds fear, which then transforms into anger, a powerful but often destructive emotion driving political fanaticism and division. Drawing on psychological experiments and political theory, he notes that voters often favor punitive measures against perceived enemies rather than supportive policies to help the disadvantaged, a dynamic that both right-wing and left-wing populists exploit. He laments that current political leaders exacerbate these divisions by appealing to resentment, making compromise and reasoned governance difficult. Both parties suffer from factional forces that prefer confrontation over coalition building. Khanna emphasizes that the country is exhausted and searching for hope, unity, and a narrative that recaptures the promise of the American dream. Healing polarization, in his view, requires leaders to meet citizens where they are emotionally while guiding them toward practical, long-term solutions grounded in economic reality.